Welcome everyone. If you are not familiar, my name is Jez. I am the Adult and Teen Programming Coordinator at the library. I'm just going to talk to you real quick about a couple of programs we have coming up. On Tuesday, that's the 27th at 7 p.m., we have Spooky Stories, which is our annual program with the Green Man Theater Troupe. So they will be telling different stories, getting ready for Halloween, get some spooky atmosphere going. On Thursday next week, the 29th at 7:30, it's a little bit later than normal, we have Chef Maddox will be back doing Cozy Comfort Cuisine. I think that's something that we could all use right about now. And then the following Monday, November 2nd at 6:30, we have Senior Housing 101. So if you are a senior or you're just looking forward to the future, here's all the different options you have in the area, different ways that you can get a better deal on housing. So I think that's going to be very helpful to many of you. And tonight, our speaker tonight is Matt Barron, creator of Go Figure, Making Numbers Count. Always someone who viewed the world through a mathematical lens, he launched this program nearly 20 years ago in the midst of his journalism career. For over a decade, Go Figure was geared almost exclusively toward journalists all around the country. Tonight, with the current presidential campaign cycle as a backdrop, Matt will peel back the curtain on how he has trained those journalists to use numbers accurately, effectively, and responsibly in their storytelling. Fortunately, not every journalist has heard or heeded his counsel. So this interactive workshop equips citizens to become more discerning news consumers. Attendees immediately apply these important lessons through a game of Go Olympics and emerge with a heightened numbers sense in their day-to-day lives. Over the course of his 20-year journalism career, Matt was a nationally syndicated math columnist and also reported for Time, USA Today, Sports Illustrated for Kids, and the Chicago Tribune, among others. Most recently, his baseball column, Go Figure, appears every Sunday in the Daily Herald Sports section. And now I will turn it over to Matt, and we'll go figure together.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Jez, and welcome to everybody. And it's funny, this past weekend with the Daily Herald, they each column I throw in at least a few different questions, and then the answers are at the end of the column. And this week, for whatever reason, the print version of that, they did not include that. They had it on the online version. I let the editor know, and they put a correction the next day. And it was reassuring to know that at least one reader contacted the paper to say, hey, where are the answers? So that was a kind of nice little unintentional test. Do people actually care about the answers to these baseball trivia questions? And the answer is a number of people do. And that number could be 0, could be 1. And we'll go into that a little bit, but this is actually I believe the 13th program with this kind of backdrop that I provided. The first one was actually 54 and a half weeks ago in Oak Park, where I live. And then starting in March, remember March 2020, about 39 years ago, I had 3 programs over the first 2 weeks of the month. And then the night before things all kind of really shut down, that was the last of those 3. And since then, in June, I started this way of doing it. And so it's really interesting, really tricky, but also it's opened it up to people to not have to go anywhere other than their computer or their phone to access it. So I promise it's going to be a lot of fun for me, and I think for you, because I just am passionate about numbers and storytelling and the importance that each plays with the other. One of the principles of John Allen Paulus, who's one of the greatest mathematical minds that I've ever had the pleasure of meeting and quoting in the column, is that in the book Once Upon a Number, he says that you don't tell a story for very long until numbers start to play some kind of a role. And on the reverse side of that, if you're talking about numbers in some way, it's some set of data that before long, a story will emerge. And so they're inextricably linked. And I would challenge you to find a story in today's paper or online that in the first 20 words that you don't find some quantitative element. And we'll talk about something later on called cuties, quantitative terms, which are disguised as words, but really it's mathematics going on. And it's all around us. And and we'll go into that. So for the next 85 minutes or so, we do have about an 8:30 cutoff time. So for those who are wondering, if you can be able to get to the rest of your laundry or whatever, please hold off till 8:30. But first thing I want to do though is make sure you know that the handouts that were sent to you earlier, I'll be going to that right now. And this is the first test of my technical acumen for the night, because I'm going to be share screening that, and that is the When You Go Figure ditties that I created about 19 years ago. And so, of course, whenever I go to find them, I don't, here we go. Let's see if I'm sharing this. Just a moment. Share, and okay, good. Jez, can you tell me, are you seeing this, the Go Figure sheet?
Yes.
Okay, good. I always like to check in. And by the way, Jez, just a reminder, for you, if there's a comment or a question or something that you feel is helpful and relevant for me to address as we go, I'm eminently interruptible. I worked in newsrooms where I look back on it now that I'm on my own for the last 15 years as a publicist, and 5 years before that, 6 years as a freelance reporter. I honestly don't know how I finished any stories, because there was a constant stream of interruptions in the newsroom as I was writing these stories that would appear in the paper. So with that, let me just plunge ahead a little bit with some of the principles we're going to be covering today that have to do with some of the basic elements of math that show up in our stories. In the upper left corner, you'll see in a family of 5, haven't you heard, the youngest or oldest, the median is the third. So I know in life people often say, oh, you're the middle child. I would say you're the median child. That means there's twice as many people who are older than that child and twice as many younger. And the reason I bring this up is we're talking here about averages. The next little, is that a couplet, a stanza, rock and roll lyric? I don't know. For the mean, add each number far and wide. Next, note the number of figures and simply divide. So median and mean are both expressions of that term known as average. And it's interesting, when I would work on a story and I'd ask them, so what's an average day like for you? Or what's the average number of people that frequent this restaurant? And they say, well, it really varies. And I'd be like, okay, that's why I'm asking for the average. It's incorporating the reality of variance. But with average, there's different ways of expressing it. And some ways are more accurate, or at least a more fair representation of that. And so one thing to think about is, if we have, say, 17 people in this setting right now, roughly, I'm guessing, that means that the person who's number 9, in terms of, let's say, their age, that's the median age, right? Half are older, half are younger. But let's say a 350-year-old person somehow existed and came into our setting, that would not really affect the median that much at all, because you just incrementally move it. But if the mean were what we're talking about, that would skew it way higher than is really a fair reflection of the majority of the people in the room. So that's a long way to go beyond the Panama Canal type of story to talk about the importance of knowing what's behind these terms that we encounter in our stories. And so that when you see average, it's to be really careful. What are we talking about? And there's also a third type of average known as a mode, which I won't go into that much, and it's hardly ever really used in storytelling, but mode has to do with the number that pops up most frequently. Okay, so onward. And Jez, is anyone raising hands or crying out in agony or anything?
We're good so far.
Okay, good. So I'm going to hit on about half of these. The next thing I want to touch on is the fastest growing this, biggest dropping that. Always be wary of any hyphenated stat. Right? So right now, I encourage you to actually, if you're near a search engine, somewhere near you, type into Google or whatever search engine you have, type in the words fastest growing. Go ahead, you have my permission. You won't be distracted, we're actually learning together. Fastest growing, and then see what auto-fills, what word or words show up, right? And fastest growing crime, fastest growing population, what is it, right? And I invite you to type into the chat box, what are some of the words that you see? Beyond that, though, the point I want to really make is that the term fastest growing is one of the most frequently used ways to mislead or to sometimes hype something up, right? And one of the things that comes to mind is that fastest growing implicitly is saying there's a time and a space that is being bounded by that term, right? Over what span of time is it fastest growing, and over what span of geography? Is it in Illinois, across the country, across the world? What are we talking about here? And so that's where prepositions can be really important. Say, so if you're into truthful advertising, I think it's important to say among the fastest growing XYZs, right? But a related point to this is with any numbers that are really big, it's hard for them, or anything is really big. Let's say the gross volume of sales for a 100-year-old company that's in the top 10 in sales right now. Fill in the blank, right? It's a lot harder for them to double or triple in size because they're so big. But for a startup, for a relatively small enterprise, doubling and tripling, I made a joke earlier in this program at around 658 that we had just doubled in size because 2 people had joined Jez and myself in this forum. And so it's to be really careful about the ways that numbers can be, or phrases can be used to cause folks to try to believe something in a certain way. And so with percentage change, don't settle. Obtain the raw data to show your mettle, right? And so I'm a big believer in both. Get both the raw data and figure out ways to convey it in a fashion that people can actually see it. And so at the top of the second column, with numbers huge and small, just convert to another size. That way your audience can see it with their eyes. And so there's all sorts of ways to express the 330 million people in our country. But one way to think about it is, what does that proportion represent in terms of the global population? It's around 4%. It's a little over 4% of the world's population is in the United States. So that's about 1 out of every 25 people, right? So you can picture a classroom with 25 people, one's an American, okay? So that's a way of breaking it down to get a feel, so that if you look at the other areas in which the United States is represented in terms of whether it's income or crime or penchant for giving go figure programs, how big or small is that? And it's so key to have context. If you don't have context with numbers, they're pretty meaningless. And so one example is years ago, about 15 years ago, someone from the Cleveland Plain Dealer newspaper contacted me and said, hey, Matt, I heard that you provide some counsel on these types of things. I'm working on a story on the national deficit. And one of the ways that I want to illustrate it is that the number of miles between here and Jupiter and back, you could make so many trips, and that the number of miles that is equals the number of dollars in our national deficit. And I said, okay, that's really enterprising that you actually did the research to know that. But the question I would have is, has anyone made that trip, right? To actually put that in any kind of context. And of course, no one has. And so it's really substituting one imponderable thing with another, and better to really try to break it down in a way that people can conceive it. We'll go into that during the Go Olympics quiz. We're actually going to break down our national deficit. I wish I could say that we're going to solve it, but no, we're going to kind of just figure out how much we each theoretically are in arrears with. So you can see that I initially wrote this with the media in mind. In fact, the next one I'll just say, it's what my source said is surely no defense, especially when the stat defies common sense, right? And so the very end of our program, I encourage you to hang on for it. There's a classic gaffe that happened earlier this year involving a tweet that went out that was picked up by a broadcast team, national, and that team, it wasn't just the on-air talent, the producers and the graphic person, they all collaborated to push this data point out that was just mind-bogglingly wrong. And it's a pretty egregious example of how journalists get math wrong at times. But most of what we're going to be covering over the next hour or so is more subtle things, and things to really think about as a consumer of the news, but also everyone who's hearing my voice right now. You're also communicators of the news. We are all our own Gutenbergs, so to speak, where our printing press can be the phone that is in our hands, and we're texting someone, we're forwarding a story that we just came across. And one of the biggest problems that I see out there is the spread of misinformation and really inaccurate information. And it's our responsibility, in my view, as citizens, to really make sure that if we're forwarding something, that we have some level of confidence that there's accuracy that is brimming in that story. Maybe not perfect. And as a reporter for over 2 decades, I can tell you, I never wrote the perfect story. so much of what I chose not to put in the story showed biases and limitations of my own knowledge and confidence about how to use that information. And so, not to say that, any story has it all right, but there's clearly a difference between jaywalking, which is, okay, the Washington Post, the New York Times, or USA Today, they misspell someone's name, or they bungle a fact in some way. Don't throw them under the same bus as you would throw someone that's clearly a disinformation artist who's trying to, just pass along something that is flat out wrong, just to put it bluntly. And so these false equivalencies that are out there, be wary of those as well. So I'll get off my high horse, come back down, go down to fudge figures abound towards the bottom of the second column. Consider several, some, and many. Sometimes you need to be precise right down to the penny. Back in 2000, during the election in Florida, right, out of those millions of votes cast, it was 49.9 to 49.9. No, I'm sorry, I think it was 48.9% each. Ralph Nader got 2%. But that was really pretty darn important to really drill down, right, to understand how close that race was. But looking up a few lines here, look at several, some, many. What does that mean? Has anyone ever received a check for several $1,000s and tried to cash it? What do you think you're going to get? What's the response? I'm not inviting you to do this, but it'd be interesting to see if you wrote in several thousand, see, maybe they'd misread it as 7, right? But how much or how many to you is several? And this is another Google moment. You could type into your search engine, type in several, and then see what autofills. I bet million or thousand or even billion or trillion will pop up. There are stories that accompany the word several with these major multipliers. And so what we're doing when we write this, when we say that, is that we're compounding vagueness and potential confusion. And so, again, I'm not the several police. I'm not saying you can never use the word several, but it's to be mindful. It means different things to different people, different quantities. And in fact, here's another request. If you could type into the chat box, and you can send it to the whole group, or you want to send it just to Jez if you feel more comfortable, or to me, but how much or how many is several? So I'm going to have a sip of water. I'm going to have several ounces of water while you type that in, and it's going to give us time to think that through. All right. And later on, feel free to do that, but I'm going to circle back because I've done this for 19 years, and it's really entertaining to see what people say and what every single time, I think it's every single time there's been something that's been missing with some people's description. They don't do something that they should do. We're talking about that. So last question or last stanza in the second column, how are the questions posed? Who paid the cash? Holding a survey to scrutiny can debunk it in a flash. Not all surveys are created equal. Some surveys are rigorous in their scientific efforts to really get to a fair representation of the audience that they're purporting to represent and say, here's the sentiment on this candidate or this issue. And so we'll go into that a little bit later on as well. But there's bias in anything, but it's a matter of how do you limit the bias? How do you try to keep that down to a minimum? In fact, the first question in Go Olympics, under great moments in numbers history, is going to talk about the 1948 presidential election and a survey or a poll, and it was done. All right, as for the rest, okay, I'm going to read the last pre-italicized stanza, and that is, yes, behind every number isn't some quantity bigger. At the heart of it all is a human figure. And the point there is that to think about numbers don't come out of nowhere. They come from some individual or group of individuals that have done some measurement. They've done some kind of calculation to come up with a number. And because people are biased and people make mistakes, that number in itself is something to be treated with skepticism. And not to say that, you dismiss all numbers, but it's to go, how much weight do you assign to this number? And so just understand that it comes from people, but also oftentimes is reflecting and talking about people. And to remember whether it's got to do with insurance and how many people in this country are struggling with health insurance, or the cost of Medicare or Medicaid, and all these different policies that are bandied about, in these debates. It's understand it comes back to people, all right? And in speaking of that, here's the last thing I want to say before we go to the Go Olympics, is when I started out in journalism back in the 1980s, the City News Bureau used to have a saying that was passed on to generations of curmudgeonly journalists like me, and it was this: if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. And so the point with this program is, if someone says a statistic, be sure to check it out. Don't take it at face value. So with that healthy skepticism bordering on paranoia behind us, I'm going to stop the share of this. We're going to go to Go Olympics. But before I do that, Jez, are there any folks that have opined on what several is?
We got the Google definition.
Okay, so people are mingling my two requests, right? Google certain
Yes.
phrases. Okay, so Google says several is more than two, but not many. Okay. All right, so it's anywhere from 3 to, so how much is many, right? So there's more vagueness that creeps in there. So I appreciate that. All right. Let's see if there's anything else. Yeah, this still is, yes, this is still go figure. So one of the things that I was referencing earlier that people often leave out when I've asked this question in person, that thing would be in the same room together at the same time, if you remember those days. People would say, well, it's more than 4. It's more than 3. I thought, okay, it could be 6 million, because you didn't give me an upper bound. And it's funny how people say, oh, it could be. Like, really? Several could be 6 million? How is that, right? So it's typically 3 to 9 is the range. And I think I've beaten the several horse strongly enough, so we'll move on to Go Olympics. Anything else, Jez, at this point?
We're good to go.
We're good to go. So let me do my next share. And this is always fun to show my sharing prowess. Hold on a second. Here we go. Good, this should be popping up. Does everyone see the Go Olympics game on the screen?
Not yet.
Okay. Let me try this again. Let's go share and new share.
There
Here
we go.
Okay, good. All right. It's doing okay now?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. That's always the biggest nail biter in these programs, is me sharing these things properly. So let's dive into Go Olympics. And we've got this really cool feature known as polls, and Jez is going to be my sidekick. In fact, before we even go to this one, Jez, there's one initial poll question that is not even Go Olympics related. It's more, who's with us tonight? So if you could share that first question about how many times people have voted. So if you could just type in the right, whatever corresponds to you, how many presidential elections you have voted in, including this year, if you've already cast your ballot. And if you plan to, you can kind of nudge it to that next number. And I realize we may have some 18 or 19-year-olds that haven't yet voted, right? They didn't get to vote 4 years ago. So what is the answer? And so those numbers should start rolling in. I'm not sure if you're seeing the numbers rolling in of people's response to it, Jez.
Yes, I can see them.
Oh, good. So whenever you feel is a good time to wrap up this, and we'll be able to share it and see what the responses are.
Yeah.
Okay. And very good. Here we go. So we've got 12 people have responded. 5 voted 5 to 8 times. And that's me. 4 have voted 9 to 12 times. 2 have voted 13 or more times. So we're talking about people who are septuagenarians, probably, maybe an octogenarian in there. Congratulations. I'm only a quintogenarian, right? Anyway, and 1 person has voted in 1 to 4. So we've got a pretty active, engaged group here tonight, which I would expect. That's great. 1988 was the first time I ever voted in an election, and so I've been able to vote in one ever since. And so very good. So that was just a fun thing, just to find out who's with us tonight in terms of that. And I do encourage everyone to vote early or not often, right? Just one time. All right, let's go to the first question. On the eve of the 1948 U.S. presidential election, the Gallup poll, which had correctly predicted the 3 prior presidential elections, gave challenger Thomas Dewey a 5 percentage point lead over President Truman. This perception was something that prompted the Tribune to prematurely call the election for the New York governor. So, as it turned out, Gallup's quota sampling approach had a fatal flaw. What was that flaw? So there's 4 choices here, and the survey is going to pop up for you to look through. And don't agonize over this, just give your best guess. And we'll just take about 10 seconds for people to ponder this. All right, Jazz, how are we doing? Do we have a majority of folks chiming in?
So we've got 7 people that voted.
Okay.
4 of them picked C and 3 of them picked D.
All right. So, it's interesting. That's kind of reflective of our overall adult voting patterns, where about half of our country votes. And of that number, sometimes even a lack of majority, a plurality takes, right? So the answer is D, before I forget to say. It's all those things were at issue here. But a minority of adults in this country elect every president. We'll get into that later. And so, but that survey had all those flaws. So in our current environment, what are some issues that could be happening that cause undercounting or overcounting of certain segments of the population? I mean, in 2016, the outcome of that election caught a lot of people by surprise. So clearly this is a problem that is with us forever because it's an imprecise way to do it, right? We're not getting a whole head count of 130 million people who are going to vote, whatever the number may be. We're going to, try to get a sampling. And so back in 1948, one of the issues was people who were doing the questioning, the surveying for Gallup, they were going to their comfort zone of people that were nearby or more well-to-do, easier to navigate those neighborhoods. And so it left out people who are more likely to vote Democrat. So onward to question number 2. Mike Bloomberg spent over $500 million in a 3-month span. This is something that's going to come up later on in our program tonight. Then he dropped out, as you would all recall, right after Super Tuesday. What proportion of Mike Bloomberg's net worth is $500 million? Is it 9%, less than 1%, or is it 2.7%? What do you think the answer is? And this is something you can all look up, so we won't take too much time. Just do a quick trigger on whatever you think might be the right answer, and Jez will show the results. And this goes to just major, huge numbers, right? It's hard for us to conceive of what this could be. For me, $500 million would put us straight on my budget. I'll just be honest, okay? And so for him, it didn't. In fact, yeah, the correct answer is less than 1%. So 5 of you got that correct. 8 of you may have fallen prey to the specificity of 2.7%. I wrote a column years ago called Specific Stat Syndrome, where someone wants to give a veneer of authoritativeness by, 42.61% of all people make up data on the spot, right? It just because you go further doesn't mean it's any more accurate. But in any event, it's less than 1%. He was worth over $50 billion. And so this is something to think about, is what does net worth mean versus annual income? Net worth is what we accumulate over time. Hopefully it's an accumulation and not a decimation, depending on the circumstances in our life. And annual income can be, what we made in the last year, right? And by the way, we'll talk about the danger of just looking at a snapshot of 1 year, because that year could have been particularly good or bad, depending on whatever metric we're looking at. So it's best to do a 5 or 10 year average. With COVID right now, we're doing these rolling 2-week averages, right? So you don't have one day where we get too high or too low in our reaction to it. So I think that's an important math principle for so many things in life. Okay to go on to obvious observations, Jez? I'm going to go on to O. Okay, very good. I'm just checking in every once in a while, make sure that there's not a lot of questions. So under obvious observations, this is relating back to just 2 weeks ago. President or Vice President Pence and challenger Kamala Harris, they had almost equal speaking time, which frankly, I saw that debate. I did not think was equal in terms of speaking time. I had the sense that there's someone who's speaking more than the other person and speaking over her. Whoops, I just gave away my perception there. But over time, Kamala came up and it was almost exactly equal. Does this mean that the event was fair and balanced? If so, why? And if not, why not? And I don't think this is a poll question, right, Jez? This is just me being rhetorical. Oh, good. No, it's an actual poll.
The question got cut off.
Okay, good. So yes, no, or it depends. What do you think? Does it mean that the event was fair and balanced? Okay, and let's see. Okay, yes, good job, everyone. The vast majority of you, which, by the way, vast majority, how much does something have to be considered a vast majority? I think 80% is my threshold. 83% of those who answered said it depends. I think that's true because, just equal time doesn't mean that's fair and balanced, right? There's so much of the substance. It's the quality, not just the quantity. So good stuff there. Next question. Since Donald Trump became president, the Washington Post has tracked false, and for anyone that may not know this, our president's made some false and misleading claims. Sit down if you didn't know that. But he's not the first president to do this. In fact, in terms of making false and misleading claims. However, how many prior administrations, presidential administrations, has the Post tracked in terms of per day lying habits of past presidents? How many is that? And so here's where I think we might need to have people type into the chat box. Because I don't know, Jez, is it a poll question? I don't think so.
That is not a poll question.
Very good. I want people to type into chat. We've already had some good chat participants. I want to get some more chatty fingertips out there. Type in what you think. What is the number? And by the way, there have been over 40 prior administrations. Now, one of them ended after 30 days because he gave a long-winded speech in 1841, William Henry Harrison, right? One of them was the same guy twice, right? Benjamin Harrison was the sandwich, Grover Cleveland, 2 different terms. So before 45, we had 43 men serve as president of the United States. So how many of them had the Post track their per day lying habits? So any answers coming forth yet, Jez?
We've got a few people that say 0 or none. I've got a 5, a 2, and Latanya says, I'm not sure I remember the Post tracking false statements in quite this way before. So
Latanya's writing an essay. That's extra credit for Latanya for going to that effort of a full sentence. Good job. So I tricked a few of you, which gives me a little bit of satisfaction. Most of you, it seems like, were savvy to my little trick here. The answer is 0. So 0 is a number, right? They've tracked a number. And so my point in playing this little trickery is that just always be leery of someone talking about, well, a number of people, a number of experts, right? Or they say, well, who are they, right? Really probe beyond that. So I will say this. I do hope that if somebody other than Donald Trump is elected president in 2 weeks, that person is also subjected to this kind of scrutiny so that we can have from here on, a benchmark to understand. Because we know that, pretty much every president has lied one in form or fashion multiple times in their administration. The question becomes to what degree, for what reasons, et cetera, right? And so it's nothing new in terms of the fact. It's just the frequency might be a little challenging for people to top our current president. In fact, let's go to that. Over the first 3.5 years of his tenure, Trump had made over 20,000 of these false and misleading claims, or nearly 16 per day. This is based on public comments that he made or tweets, different ways of public communication. And so here's the question I would have for folks to type in the chat box, and we're getting some good traction in the chat box. Good job. Did that daily average go up or did it go down since the COVID-19 pandemic hit the US it hit us earlier than March, but March is when we really started to notice it and to really respond, right, in a concerted way. So according to that report back in July, did that go up or down? And so as people, and this might be a poll question, Jez, is it?
This one's not a poll question,
okay.
But
so
everyone is saying up.
Yes, and here's the thing. It's a function of at-bats. In baseball, Babe Ruth struck out 1,330 times in his career. At the time, that was a lot. Now he's not even in the top 100 all time for strikeouts. But the point is, I never struck out that many times in the major leagues because I never got there. And the president was communicating more with those daily press conferences for a while, so that the potential for him to misspeak, to put it nicely, there's just just more words were being uttered publicly, and therefore more things were perhaps not 100% true. Am I being diplomatic enough? I hope so. I'm trying to be straight. Okay, on to lessons and morons. And no, I was not a sophomore when I wrote that subheading. I hope you like it. Lessons and morons. According to a 2012 study by the Pew Charitable Trusts, and by the way, there's a nice little hyperlink here, so you can go check this out. At that time, what was the estimated proportion of the voting eligible population in our country that was not registered to vote? And so this is a poll question. So what do you think? So these are people that could vote, but they just aren't registered. Is it 4 or 14, or is it 24% at that time? I don't have any more recent data. If someone else does, I'd love to hear it. I'll incorporate it next time I do this. So voting eligible population. So survey says, I feel like Richard Dawson or Steve Harvey, and good job. Again, 83% of you, 10 out of 12 correctly answered, 24%. I wish that it was 4%, and hopefully it's getting closer towards 14%, but for at least that data point is 24. So 1 out of 4 people who could vote aren't even registered, and that's why registration and engagement is so important to get more of our voices involved. So as of October 10, 2020, so 11 days ago, so it's gone up, but it's not yet to 28 trillion. At that point, it's gone up to over $27 trillion. And this is where it's about bringing it down into a bite size we can get our minds around. On a per capita basis, how much approximately is that figure? Is it $82,000, $180,000 per person, or is it $8,100? And I know you all could kind of get all your calculators and do this, and that's fine if you do, but I just take a stab at it. 27 divided by 33 are the two numbers, and there's a bunch of zeros. So the first number should be an 8. Because 27 over 33, it's like 0.81 or 0.82. And so survey says, or the respondents say, 82,000, right, very good. So a plurality of you, 5 out of the 11 that answered, that's the correct answer, $82,000. So a more relevant question is this, how bad of a piece of news is this? How important is it? And I think Harry Truman's the president that said that he just wish he had a one-handed economist, because the economist would always say, well, on the one hand, but on the other hand, right? And so there's differing views as to the severity or the seriousness of how concerned we should be, but it's clearly the smaller the number, the better for overall long-term health as a country financially. And by the way, I put this graph in here just to show, if you look at it closely, you'll see it has 2019 and forward as projected years. So this is clearly a graph that's a couple of years old, and you can see where we've already exceeded. So 2023 at that point had been the projection of when we'd hit $27 trillion of gross federal debt, and we're already there in 2020. So we're overachieving in the debt department. But another point to make about this is that these charts, these graphs, these are guesses. These are educated guesses. They're controversial guesses, just like with the COVID era of trying to figure out the math, and we're going to follow the science. Well, science involves a lot, including a lot of data, and where does that data come from? And so real quick, I'll mention, one of the data points that I know the president referenced last week in his interview with Savannah Guthrie. He made a comment along the lines that 85% of people who wear masks got COVID. Not accurate. The real story there is that of the people who had gotten COVID, that's a different universe that we're talking about now, right? It's the pool of people who've gotten COVID. Of that pool, 85% of them said that they wore masks at various times. But again, remember, masks are for protection of other people, not even us. So if you're wearing a mask and other people aren't wearing masks, you're still more in jeopardy than if they were wearing masks. So that was a digression. Hope it was instructive. Let's go to yes or no. Yes? All right. Any interruption that we need to make at this point, Jez? I'm probably over-checking with you. So we're going to do yes or no. During the October 7th debate, Vice President Pence stated that according to the National Oceanic Administration, there are no more hurricanes now than a century ago. Is that true? Yes or no? Okay, so in our 8th question here, let's see how many people got this right. And there's going to be a moral to the story after this because I'm not going to stop there. So the answer, most of you said no. Actually, the 3 that said yes, you're correct. That is accurate as far as it goes. What is really important to consider, though, is that that's not the only data point that's relevant in the conversation about climate change and all the fallout from it. The question that needs to be asked is, how severe are the hurricanes now compared to a century ago? And they are a lot more significant. And so that's where, in isolation, a data point can be incomplete at best and maybe even misleading, or worse than that. So just to understand that context. Now, getting 30%, here's the next question, of the voter eligible vote is usually more than enough to win a presidential election. So we just learned about voter eligible, right? We're talking about everyone that could vote, even though not everyone's registered. 30%, it's usually more than enough. Is that right? And a few seconds. And by the way, I feel like tonight's group, you guys are really, guys and and ladies, I don't even know what the PC term is. You people, you individual human beings, are doing great. You're answering a lot more swiftly than prior groups. So, Jez, what do you say? What's the response at this point? And yes, good. It's uncanny. 10 to 2 it's like a split jury, 10 to 2, right? In a civil trial, this would probably be enough, but in criminal, we need to get these other 2 to the yes column. So, yes, it is more than enough. In fact, in 2016, Hillary Clinton got a little over 27% of the voter eligible vote, and Donald Trump got right at 27%. So in any story you encounter, voter turnout always means only one thing: the percentage of those who voted from among the number of registered voters. Yes or no? So here we are. Yes or no? For anyone that's ever been in a relationship, you know that the words always and never can be a little dicey. I might be putting my thumb on the scale of how to answer this. Always means this. Does it? Okay. So my goal in this is to really raise your antenna when you do see stories that refer to voter turnout and the percentage of voter turnout, to really make sure you're reading closely what is it that they're talking about. Is this apples to apples with other stories on other elections? And so, yes, 8 of you answered it correctly. 8 said no. 3 of you said yes. So it does not always mean that. And so just take my word for that. I've looked it up. And so there's an inconsistency there. And sometimes it's just because people are just going off of what's been done before without really thinking through, what these terms really mean. So the median letter in Go Olympics is the letter M. How perfect, right? There's 4 that we've gone through. There's 4 more to come after M. But right now we're on medians, modes, and means. And of those 3 M averages, what do people usually mean when they say average? What do they usually mean? Do they mean median? Do they mean mode? Or do they mean mean? And let's see what folks have done. People are thinking about, I can feel the, yes, good job. 8 out of 12 here, mean. So that's just a memory device for y'all. When you see the word average, what it usually means is mean. But if it doesn't say it explicitly, really, you can dig beneath it. Does this mean median? Now, the next question, we've got about 13 candidates here, from Biden all the way to Steyer. The average level of support for these 13 Democrats, this is from a year ago, the average level of support of these 13 was A, 6.9, B, 2.2, was it 1 or 1.4, or was it all of the above, the average level of support? I'm kind of a fan of the all of the above option. Doesn't mean that that's the answer, I'm just saying. Okay, so what is the average level of support for these folks? What are folks saying here? And very good. A majority of you correctly said all of the above. It's all of those. So which is the mean? Which is the median? The mode? I'll tell you right now. So 6.9% is the mean, meaning you take all these numbers, you add them up, divide by 13, you come to 6.9. 2.2% is the median. That's Beto O'Rourke had 2.2% support. That's why he's a former candidate, not the nominee. Half had more at that point and half had less. And then the mode were those who had the number that popped up most often was 1 and 1.4 were tied with 2 each. And so you can see where you can say, well, the average level of support is 1%, right? That's clearly a real misstatement or a misrepresentation of the spirit of the data, but that's out there. So that's my little moral of that triple M story. Now we're on to percentages. And for those of you who've been looking forward to this, here we are. Okay, so we're about, by the way, 50% into our overall program, including the Q&A. We're around 70% through the program if you have to bolt before we get to Q&A. So with this, as of October 10th, Democratic Joe Biden had 52.1% support, while President Trump had 42%, according to the average, here's that word, of general election polls. Okay, so with that level of support, does that mean that he was ahead of President Trump by 10.1 percentage points? Did he have the support of 24% more voters than Trump did? Or are both of those statements the truth and saying the same thing? What do you think? All right. Both are true. Very good. Less participation on that one. I know that's a lot of bouncing balls to kind of track it all. And so both of those statements are true. And so this is where we go into the difference between percent and percentage point. And I'll walk us through that in different ways as we go along here. And so let's go to the, in fact, just real quick illustration is thinking about the Illinois income tax. It was at 3% about a decade ago, a little less than a decade ago, and then it was moved up to 5%. Do you remember that? So that went up by 2 percentage points, right? Because the most you could be taxed is 100%, right? The Beatles sang about tax man, 95%, right? So 3% to 5%, so 2 percentage point increase, but in terms of percent increase, that's in terms of the actual dollars, that's a 67% increase. 2 over 3 equals 66.7%. So that's a quick illustration of the difference between percent change and percentage point change. All right, for the below graphic, the composition of American voters by gender between 1980 and 2016. And each year, like clockwork, it's been 53 point something of females and 46 point something for males, going back these last 10 election cycles. The percentage point difference in the last election was 7.2. And here's where the poll question is going to pop up. What percent more women than men voted in that election? So here's where it's to try to figure out what is the denominator. And more women than men, that verbiage is an expression of a math equation. Than men means the percentage of men who voted should be the number in the denominator. So that's all I'll say. We'll see how you do on this one. Okay. And inducing a few headaches maybe out there. So good job. 7 out of 10 of you got it right. So the correct answer is 15.5% more women, because 46.4% is what should be the denominator. So that's for every 100 men that voted, 115 women voted. And I think that's a more honest, or at least clear depiction of the difference than 53, 54 to 47-ish, because 53 to 47 seems kind of close. And it's not, because it's 53 to 47 consistently millions of times over. So on to I, infinite intrigue. And we're talking about ways of illustrating numbers and thinking about them in different terms to make them more clear. So 1,000 times 1,000 is a million times 1,000 is 1 billion, a billion times 1,000 is a trillion, etc. If 1 million seconds equals 11 and a half days, then about how long is 1 billion seconds? All right, and this is something you can solve easily. Just gives you best quick answer. My point in conveying this is to have you really understand that with these big numbers, there's ways to express them in different, with different units of measure that are more relatable. So as communicators of it, I wrote a story for the USA Today 21 years ago about a Powerball winner, and there was a wager, not a wager, Powerball is wagering, but there was a situation where the bartenders that bought him his ticket were suing him. They claimed that he had promised them $1 million. Instead, he gave them $10,000. And I said, that's the equivalent of like a penny for every dollar that he promised, a way to bring it down to something more bite-sized for people. So the correct answer is indeed, most of you got this, almost 32 years. So 11 days, 32 years, a million versus a billion, big difference, all right? So you can kind of think about those numbers in those relative terms in that way. All right, now on to the next question. On October 10th, President Trump's approval rating was 43.3%. At the same point in their tenures, 4 presidents over the last 75 years had lower approval ratings than that. Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter, and the elder Bush. At 32.6%, which president's approval level was the lowest from this group? Was it Truman, Johnson, Carter, or George H.W. Bush? And a quick little hint is that later on, 25 years after this president's tenure, he had the highest approval rating among all living presidents at that point. So a little bit too late for him for his re-election prospects, but a little vindication. And this shows also the timing of these polls and the timing of events. Right? I remember in 1988, my first election as a voter, and it looked like Michael Dukakis was going to run away with it, and Bush got elected. And so, okay, we have pretty split. The average answer is three of these candidates or presidents have 2 people thought it was them. 4 of you thought it was Jimmy Carter, so a plurality of you thought it was Jimmy Carter, which is a good guess because he's clearly a very popular president. He had a tough presidency in terms of a lot of events and things. The actual answer is George H.W. Bush. He's the one. He's the one that had an actual lower rating than President Trump does now. So kind of interesting. That jumped out at me recently. I thought, I'll throw this in there. Okay, on to the penultimate category. It's common sense. Consider the below graph. This is American voters by age. From 18 to 29 is the youngest age group, all the way to 65 plus. And I feel like we've probably got every age group represented on this call today. Which age group is the fastest growing group of voters since 1980? Is it the 65 plus or 45 to 64 age groups? So if you look down, 45 to 64 went from 32.5% of those who voted were in that group back in 1980. It went up to 37.6%. However, the oldest age group was only 16.8% 40 years ago. It went up to 24.2%. Which was fastest growing? What do you say? Very good. Almost all of you, 10 out of 12, 65 plus is the correct answer. It's around a 45% increase from 16.8 to 24.2 is around 45% increase. The other one is around a 15% increase. The smaller something is, the more potential it has to gain. And so that's something to keep in mind. So let's ask the same question since 2012. There's only 2 groups that have actually went up from 2012 to 2016. It's the youngest group, the 18 to 29 year range, versus the 65 plus. Which of those 2 groups was the fastest growing group of voters since 2012 to 2016? And so that, I think, will pop up as a survey or a poll.
Now, the next one I have is which age group has the greatest potential?
Oh, okay, good. So let's go to that one. Well, so for this one, by the way, it's still the oldest age group. They went up by around 9% from 22.3 to 24.2. And the youngest age group just went up by about 2%, 0.3 of a percentage point, but around 2% overall. So let's move to the next one. Thanks, Jess, for that. Who do you think is the greatest potential? Which is a real cursed word, right? You've got so much potential to become the fastest growing group in the years to come. What do you think? Do you think it's the youngins, or is it the seniors, the elder statesmen and stateswomen in our population that have the greatest potential to become the fastest growing? And so this little preview, you can mark your calendar for mid-November, late November of this election cycle, and there'll be stories about this particular group and how they have risen so much. It's because they were so right. 7 out of 10 of you say it's the youngest age group, and I think that is the more correct answer. It's not definitively, though, because the thing is with the 18 to 29-year-old group, that's a finite dozen-year span. It looks like 11 years, it's really 12. It's 18 to 29.99. 65 plus, there's no upper bound, right? And so I can see where maybe the oldest group still will be because people are living longer, staying engaged, etc. But I have a feeling it will be probably the younger group. But one thing that this calls into question, though, is the whole paradigm of these categories. Why do we still have that 65 is the last bracket? Why isn't it 65 to 79 and then 80 plus? And I think the time will come that we start to break it out that way because of our increasingly healthy and longer living population. So just a little observation there. I mean, and by the way, these year spans are different. There's 12, there's 15, there's 20, and then there's 30 plus. So they're not even equivalent in terms of that. So it's a bit of, there's reasoning behind it, and I get it in terms of demographics, but just something to ponder. Okay, so I think we've got the next question here coming up. Those plan to vote on Election Day on October 9th. So as of 2 weeks ago, what was the percentage point advantage that President Trump held over Joe Biden, according to the Pew Research Center, in terms of those who are voting on Tuesday, November 3rd? Is it 8 points? Is it 19 points? Or is it 32-point margin for the president among folks who are voting on the day? What is the correct answer? And I'd be curious to find out, just from our little small sampling of people on this call, how many are planning to vote on that day versus have already voted or are going to vote between now and then. So before we get off the call, I'd love to know. I plan to vote on the day of. My wife says that's risky. She tried to vote today and the line was 2 or 3 hours long. And so I've done it both ways in the past. I prefer to vote the day of. It just makes me feel a little more in the moment. I know it's a little risky, which I'll go into that, by the way, later in terms of probability and risk. So please bring me back to that later. Somebody make a note. Okay, among those planning to vote. Okay, so 8 out of 9 of you answered faithfully, but inaccurately. The answer is 32 points. There's a huge margin. It's a 2-to-1 ratio of Trump supporters versus Biden supporters plan to vote on Election Day. I wonder if that might be a little factor in why there's some doubts being cast on the casting of ballots before Election Day. I don't know. All right. And by the way, among those who are voting absentee or by mail, there's around 70 million Americans. Biden has a huge and even bigger advantage, 69 to 27. So it's like two different worlds there. So on to S. We're on the finale, final letter. We're 2 minutes to 8. I'm pretty much on track with the timing. In the 2000 U.S. presidential election, how many third-party candidates received more than 537 votes from Florida voters? And that was the gap between the two major parties in that election. How many third-party candidates were there? I already mentioned Ralph Nader earlier. He was the primary third-party candidate with 2% of the vote. But there were a bunch of others, or maybe just a few others. What do you say? I think it's safe to say that there are several others. I think all these numbers could qualify as several. I should have put that in there just to be a little bit of a troll. All right. So you are all now in receipt of really good deep trivia. One of you got this correct. 8. There are 8 third-party candidates. So I guess that means there was a 10th party candidate that all received more than 537 votes. Most of them got thousands of votes. Now, that's not to say that that would have swung the election, right? because it's not to say it would have all gone to one or the other candidate. Though I've got to believe that the 2% that voted for Nader, that could have definitely swung it. All right. Okay, here we go. Here's where I'm going to do my sharing of a video. So I'm going to stop the share briefly. So let's do this. Hold on. This is going to be worth it. It's going to take me a few moments to pull this up on the screen and make sure I do it right. So everyone tune in to this little gem. Hold on.
Your screen is not shared yet.
Oh, okay. I had a feeling I had forgotten to share. Hold on a second. Let me, okay, share screen. Here we go. Thanks, Jazz.
MS in this little bit from my file of how you should never trust journalists when it comes to...
Jazz, is it showing?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, here we go. It's about 40 seconds long that we'll listen to. Hold on, folks.
Maths and numbers and stuff. Have a look at this little exchange on MSNBC. Their grasp of maths is astounding. Even as they're reading out these numbers, the lunacy of what they're saying doesn't occur to them.
Somebody tweeted recently that actually with the money he spent, he could have given every American $1 million.
I've got it. Let's put it up on the screen. When I read it tonight on social media, it kind of all became clear. Bloomberg spent $500 million on ads. U.S. population 327 million. Don't tell us if you're ahead of us on the math. He could have given each American $1 million and have had lunch money left over. It's an incredible way of putting it.
It's an incredible way of putting it. It's true. It's disturbing.
It's true, and it's disturbing. Hey ho. I'm moving to the US now as a political consultant. $1 million campaigning.
Okay. All right. Back at you, everyone. Stop that here. So, okay. Am I back on the air here?
Yes.
Instead of that Australian journalist? Okay, good. So that leads me into this next question. So here we go. So let's share this. So he spent $500 million. This is the tweet that they found, and that was propagated on March 3rd. All right. To the closest dollar, how much could Bloomberg actually have given each American? So this is, I think, a poll question. Yes. So how much could he have given each American? $1, $2, or $10? A far cry from $1 million. Okay, let's see. And what are folks saying on this one? And it's a close race between $1 and $2. It's $1.53, so technically it's a $2 bill would have been the closest dollar that Bloomberg could have given each American, okay? So that was obviously a pretty extreme example of a journalistic error. And it wasn't just the two on-air broadcasters, it was the whole team around them. And so that's an extreme example. But there's all sorts of more subtle ways that we've covered on how numbers can be cast in different lights that are less than perfect. So, oh yes, and here's a quick survey question that the library wants to know. Please do answer this. How many people are watching on your device? So as you're answering that question, I'll just mention that I've got a number that does not show up in all these choices, and that's the number is 0, and that's how much credibility you should give anyone who's got neon lights and exclamation points and italics and all sorts of devices to get your attention. A lot of times those things are used to actually be in place of substance, right? It's a lot of just hype. And so my hope is that you don't rely on hype or get swayed by hype, but really try to dig in. If someone tells you a number, to check it out. So, and please do answer. If we get 100% participation on this question, I'll be happy. We got around 85, 90% for most of the other questions. And so as you answer that for Jez, I guess we can open it up now for Q&A. I'll stop this share. Oh wait, I'm gonna go back and share it actually. I'm gonna go back to the next sheet, the last sheet, and you all have this in your inbox. And if you don't, we can get it to you. I think Jez shared it through the chat. Some recommended reading on topics that cover some of the same ground that I covered. in their own ways, and really very entertaining and insightful stuff by all these writers. And this is just a small sampling. There's a lot of good stuff out there. And so check that out and enjoy and learn as you go. And then so let me stop that share and be able to, hold on. Good, was I even sharing that? I don't even know if I was even sharing that there.
Yeah, you're not sharing right now.
I'm not sharing a thing. I'm just talking as if I'm sharing. I'm not sharing. I'm not being nice. Okay, let me quickly share. This page is what it's referencing. It's the page after the Gold Olympics ends. It's recommended reading and some of these resources. And so some pretty good stuff on there. George Schaffner, The Arithmetic of Life and Death. Really folksy, very accessible stuff. So if you're not a math geek the way I am, I think you'll still enjoy it and get a lot out of it. John Allen Paulus, who I interviewed him at least 2 or 3 times, and I got to meet him back in the late 90s. Brilliant guy. And so he's written a number of books. I think he's in double digits easily by now. Anywhere from 10 to 99, I guess, of books. And so I recommend him as well. And I'll stop that share. So we're now at 8:06. We're in the portion of the time that's a little more free form. And so I appreciate everyone's time here. And yeah, let's go back. How many people here have voted already? We've gotten some people answering. It looks like those who have answered so far have either voted already or they're going to vote before November 3rd. Is there anyone that's going to vote on November 3rd with me? I'm not saying you need to, I'm just curious. But beyond that, we're going to also invite people to unmute, if we can do that, Jez, if you want to do that, to ask a question. You'll have the audio capacity to throw a question at me, or you can type in the question through chat. And there's also a function known as Q&A that you can type it into Q&A to ask your questions about anything we've covered or anything from my time as a journalist. I've covered the gamut of from courts to crime, city hall, sports, business, news that was breaking, news that wasn't broke at all. So whole host of things. And so in anticipation of the first question, which hopefully someone will make, but if not, that's okay too. More time for me to shoot free throws tonight, if so. Back in 2001, 2002, I was reporting for Time Magazine on a story on legalizing marijuana. And one of the biggest and most prominent advocates of legalizing marijuana was Peter Lewis, who is the founder of Progressive Insurance. And he was in the hospital at the time when I called him. He just had surgery for something. And I got him on the phone, and I said to him, and I'd done some reading to know going into it that he was this public advocate and talked about his marijuana use. And so I wanted to re-clarify that. I'd say, you smoke marijuana? Yes. And I said, how often? And he said, regularly. Now, by this point, I knew that was a cutie. That was a quantitative term. He was giving me a word that was a fill-in for more data. And so my next question was, how often is regularly? And he didn't answer in any more depth. He declined to go into that, but I knew I had to ask the question because I know there are some people that I've known that regular consumption of something is not the other person's regular, right? It's quite irregular. It's quite different. So, okay, so here's a question. What are my thoughts on, and I'll answer these from the bottom up, my thoughts on the COVID positivity ratio. To lower it, wouldn't you just have to send a bunch of healthy people to get a test? So yeah, that would take a concerted effort for people to, and in fact, I remember early on, I was like, because we need to get below 10%, I think, was a threshold at that point to be able to open things up a little bit, I believe. And so yeah, that is a way of potentially manipulating it. But with the data set that we're dealing with, I mean, there's 12.7 million Illinoisans, there's 2.5 million Chicagoans, there's, I don't know, over 1 million in DuPage County, 400,000 or so in King County, et cetera, right? To do that in a concerted way, to manipulate it. And I'm not suggesting, Donald, that you're saying that it should be tried, but to lower it, I think what you need to do is, I think the increase in testing. So let me back up. Yes, the answer is, and I think we should send a bunch of healthy people. The reason why is they're not all healthy, right? That's a major part of the problem, is that it's asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, and that's how it's spreading, and we don't even know it. And so if we could all be tested the way the NFL or the major leagues or NBA was tested, more power to us, in my view. So I've been tested 2 or 3 times. I should know the exact number. Twice. Both times negative, and both times, didn't think I was. It was a precautionary thing. What was my most infamous story? So whether it's the story that made me infamous or that I was writing about infamous people, I'm not sure. There's a whole bunch. I covered a case in Kane County in the late 90s involving a young man who was in prison for 50 years, a 50-year sentence. He'd been sent there around 3 years earlier, and the case relied largely on a jailhouse informant who had less than sterling credibility. And there was some involvement of a police investigator who had used this person as a source before, and it really reeked of injustice. And covering the courts as I did for about 3 years in Kane County, I wasn't one to champion causes because I knew that there's always so many elements to the story that I didn't know. But I looked into this enough to really get a strong sense. And I just reported the facts as I gathered them and as I gave people the opportunity to respond. And ultimately, that prisoner was released from prison. He pleaded guilty to a lesser charge. He'd already served time. And so that was very satisfying to me that my work played a role in justice being served. I could go on to many war stories, and I'll circle back to more later. I'll get to some of these questions. Another question is, have I always valued this kind of literacy? Was there a story project that led me to develop it? Good question. It was, I'm sure it was an incremental thing over time that I didn't even realize was happening. Much of my career early on in my teens was covering sports, and so statistics and data all over the place with that. And so usually not such serious stuff in terms of daily decisions, right? It was how many points someone scored and all that. But eventually, as I became like the resident math consultant in my newsroom, for 8 years, from 91 to 99, I wrote for the Courier News in Elgin, and there's some sister newspapers as well that I wrote for in the Copley chain at the time. And people would come to me and ask me to help them on how to navigate a certain data point in their story. And so through that, in 1997, I began writing a column. An editor, a friend of mine who knew of my numbers sense and passion, said, "Hey, how would you like to write a numbers column about anything you want to do with data?" And it took me less than 1 second to say, absolutely. I mean, of course, it involved $0 more of pay, but that's okay. I was already working. And so that really heightened my awareness and interest in all things mathematical and storytelling and graphs and how they can be used to, quick story. When the stock market plunges in a given day, and say it goes from, this is 20 years ago, there wasn't 20,000 plus then, and let's say it was around 8,000, I forget what it was, and let's say they went down 400 points. Well, if you go from 8,000 to 7,600, that's only a 5% decline. But these graphs, the newspapers were using, were showing the bottom of the graph would say 6,000. And so it would start at 6,000 and then move up to 8,000 and then go down. And it was creating a steeper slope than was really, happening. And I felt like that's not necessarily the most honest way of depicting what just happened. It's a 5% drop. It's a big deal, but this is misleading. So a little bit of a tangential answer to a good question. So let's see. Any other questions? The video shared was something, okay. Any specific recommendations of journalists you feel use numbers well in their reporting, either local or national? Okay, so 538. If you go to 538.com, they use numbers in a way that's like gives math doctorate students and professional mathematicians, I'm sure, gives them a run for their money. Very sophisticated use of numbers. I listen to the 538 podcast. At least once a week. They don't come out every day. It's about 2 or 3 podcasts a week. So I think they're very good. I don't read the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times often, but when I do, and when I see the stories, there seems to be a real measured, no pun intended, thoughtful way of illustrating numbers. And so, I think it's so important to provide context and know, what does this mean? Like early voting numbers. If you're reading a story by the Tribune or Daily Herald or some local publication around here that is saying, yeah, there are X number of people that have done early voting so far. If they don't also indicate what the number was 4 years ago or 8 years ago, or some data to put some frame of reference on that, it's incomplete. And so until they have that other data, I think what's the point? There's really, it's in a vacuum. And so a little bit of a rant. So, John Stossel, who I don't see him much anymore. I'm not even sure of the stats of his career, but he has a way, and I know he's more on the right end of the spectrum politically, or at least he was, is more conservative. One thing I do recommend, by the way, is to get your information from multiple sources and from different sides of the spectrum politically, just to see, because I think there's something to be learned from both ends, and it's not all good or bad, right? There's truth in there, and sometimes it might be an emphasis in a place that maybe you disagree with, but I think it's important that we engage. And there's a website that I think is important called allsides.com. I'm not sure if anyone else has heard of this, but allsides.com. And on their website, they actually rate different newspapers and other publications in terms of where they are, in terms of left or right or center. And they talk about their methodology. They talk about even sometimes if a publication like the Associated Press is seen as pretty much down the middle. Now, that's subjective to say they're down the middle. Some might think they're one way or the other. But sometimes there's some stories where getting both sides isn't necessarily the best way to report that story, right? I think about Williamsburg, right? There are good people on all sides or both sides. Okay, as a journalist, my job was to oftentimes give weight that I felt was due a given side. And just because 10 people spoke at a city council meeting against a zoning request or something, and they were vociferous and they were passionate and they had all sorts of charts and history, that didn't mean that they were necessarily right. It meant that that's a perspective that deserved a place in the story. But for every person that was there speaking, there were probably many people who weren't riled to action to speak out against it, that are either indifferent or supportive of it. So I think it's important to know that there's a selection bias, if that's the right term, of when you see a certain setting, you're already seeing an audience that is self-identified as passionate about the cause. And it can create a misleading effect, kind of like the violence that happened over the summer in different cities and still happens, right? And you can choose different blocks and different images to tell your story. And it's just one piece of a larger story. And so try to get to allsides.com is my answer, I guess. So that's my way of wrapping up that rather windy answer. We've got around 720 more seconds. I want to maximize them as best we can. So are there any other chats that have come through or Q&As, Jez, that you've seen that others maybe haven't seen?
Nothing yet.
Okay. So I'm trying to think of any war stories that might be interesting to share. When I was a reporter covering the courts, I would always say that if someone was acquitted, found not guilty, the word acquitted in the lead. I was paranoid that the word not would be dropped from my copy. And so I'd convict someone that was found not guilty, right? Here's one. There was a story, Riverboat Casino revenue. And this was before Elgin got the riverboat in 1994. I covered the Elgin licensing process. I was there when the gaming board voted for Elgin to get the Grand Victoria back in 1993 was what the vote, and I think 94 or 95 is when the boat launched. But there was a story in March of one particular year, or maybe it was April, and it said the revenue in March had gone up over the prior month by, I'll say 7%. I'm not sure what the number was. And the funny thing is that the number of days in March were 10% more than the prior month. So so the per day revenue went down. And so it was just, I chuckled when I saw it. I was like, that is no way to report the story. That's not the way to depict the numbers. And beyond that, you don't want to go from one month to the next because, I mentioned this earlier, very dangerous to rely on the prior you want to go for the previous year or the previous quarter from the previous year for that first quarter of the year. You have more sample size. Sampling is so key, right? So you're not having things being skewed by something that's an outlier. When I covered police, and every year there's the crime report comes out in the middle of the year and it reflects on the prior year's crime statistics for, you name it, from the smallest offenses to the most serious. And the danger in that data is if you just look at the year before that to compare it, you can make a village seem way more dangerous or way less dangerous than maybe is appropriate because you're basing it on the prior year. So you want to get a 5-year, 10-year average and even adjust for per capita when there's been a significant fluctuation in population. Another thing to think about, now I'm on a roll, so someone ask a question if you're getting bored, but in terms of police stopping people who are Black in a certain community, it's insufficient to look at the population of that community in terms of their demographics, because they're not the only ones driving through that community. And this is not to say that police don't do wrong and that there's not profiling. Clearly that happens, but it's an incomplete picture if you say, well, only 14% of people in our community are people of color and 42% of people who are stopped. Well, they're coming from other communities coming through. And that's another data point to look at, is what percentage of motorists, right? Because people don't get stopped for speeding when they're sitting in their living room. They're coming through town somehow, some way. So that doesn't add layers of complexity onto everything you see from now on. I don't know what will. One of my, I guess, personal experiments is I've been taking free throws and tracking them on a spreadsheet for the last 14 years. This is not a joke. And I do it with my left hand and my right hand. And it's an interesting thing to see in terms of our own practices and our own habits of how we can improve or decline. And I think I've declined. I don't think I'm ever going to be as good lefty as I once was. And I think I'm on the rise righty. So just a little personal. So I definitely apply this in lots of areas of my life. I track all my spending, or I used to, with cash. My wife would say, when I would withdraw money, okay, now we're in the back of that slip, $3 for coffee and all that. And so one year it was like over $2,000 of miscellaneous. And she goes, what is this? Do you have a drug habit? Is there someone else I should know about? And because I was like, it's food. 90% is food. It's muffins, it's burgers. I just don't want to mark it down. And so I live with a person she's a payroll accountant on a TV show. So she's definitely got a lot of numbers going on in her world all around. So I haven't lost more than one person in the last 10 minutes. What's going on here? I appreciate your attention, but ask a question. I'm starting to talk about random stuff. Fibonacci numbers, the golden. My first column was on 7-11, by the way, for my by the numbers column that was syndicated eventually. And does anyone know why it was called 7-11? Because it used to open at 7 and close at 11. And then it was open all the time. Southland Corporation started it down in Texas. I still remember that. Another favorite column was the mathematical humor of Spinal Tap. Who has seen This Is Spinal Tap? The mock rock documentary, 1984, I think is when it came out, or was it 82? Rob Reiner directed. They just did a Zoom kind of fundraiser, but there's great mathematical humor in Spinal Tap. So if you've heard the term of going to 11, there's a scene. I should pull up that scene sometime. I'm going to try to pull it up now, actually. I'll keep talking. But great mathematical humor. Nigel Tufnell. Here we go. 11. All right, hold on. I'm going to pull this up. This is going to be a good one. Just a moment, folks. This is worth it. For those who haven't seen it, this explains a lot of a challenge. Hold on. Here we go. All right. First time playing Spinal Tap on a Go Figure program. So you're all part of history being made. Okay, let's check this out. This is worth it. Hold on.
You actually play all these, or? Well, I play them and I cherish them. Mm-hmm. This is at the top of the heap right here. There's no
okay, we'll move it up to
the flame. I can play without all the map.
You can run anywhere on stage with that.
The old tagger on it. So you never even don't point even.
Don't even point?
No, it can't be played. Never. I mean,
can I look at it?
No, you've seen enough of that one. This is a top to what we use on stage, but it's very, very special because if you can see, the numbers all go to 11. Look, right across the board. 11,
Oh, I see.
11,
And most of
11, and
the
then
amps go up to 10.
Exactly.
Does that mean it's louder? Is it any louder?
Well, it's one louder, isn't it? It's not 10. You see, most blokes are going to be playing at 10. You're on 10 here, all the way up, all the way up,
Yeah.
all the way up. You're on 10 on your guitar. Where can you go from there?
Nowhere.
I don't know.
Nowhere, exactly. What we do is if we need that extra push over the cliff, you know what we do?
Put it up to 11.
11, exactly. One louder.
Why don't you just make 10 louder and make 10 be the top number and make that a little louder?
These go to 11.
Okay. Good. Thank you for indulging that. Did you all get something from that? Right? There's no reason, like Rob Reiner, Marty DeBerge is his stage name there. It's like, it didn't matter what number they wrote on the thing. It can play the volume it can play. So anyway, so I wrote a column about that. I wrote about Stonehenge, when there was a mistake over the size of the Stonehenge set because they had done one too many dashes. They made it was supposed to be 8 feet instead of 8 inches. So anyway, so you can tell I've had fun with numbers for a long time. I talked to a lot of classes and classrooms about the relevance of numbers in our daily lives, just how important they are. And so I think what we're going to do right now is give 30 seconds. This is known as the last call, dimming of the lights at the theater. If no one comes up with the question, we're going to let you all go. And somehow I've held on to 11 of the attendees. So you all have a special place in my heart for letting me play that. Jez, are there any other remarks you want to make about upcoming programs? I just want to again thank you and thank the library for having me share this and get this out. You can tell it's therapy for me. But I do hope that you all are a little bit more numerically literate in your world. This helps you in day-to-day life. So,
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing all of your knowledge with us.
Well, it was only 4.7% of my knowledge I shared, just to be clear. But all the knowledge that I shared it sincerely. I'm being really goofy now. So thank you all, everyone. Thank you, LaTanya, and thank you, Mike, and all those who are saying thanks. And even those who don't say thanks, I thank you for being with us tonight.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming out, and have a good evening.